Thank you for coming out tonight to listen to this talk about classical education. It's a real privilege for the Australian Classical Education Society to be able to present to the community our vision for classical education and where we believe that Australia should be heading towards for its educational future. So Joe, could I ask you please to... Thank you. So this evening, we're going to be considering an alternative form of education to the current progressive model. And I appreciate that you've come out to hear something that is genuinely countercultural at the moment, particularly to the dominant ideologies of our day and age. Nevertheless, we at the Australian Classical Education Society believe that classical education, and tonight I will specifically address its Christian form, is the answer to many of the social and educational crises we face as Australians in the 21st century. This presentation is necessarily preliminary, but we'll finish tonight, we'll have a bit of a Q&A, but we'll also finish with providing some resources. So if you'd like to pursue this with further research, that will hopefully help you. So I will speak tonight for about 50 minutes on the theory behind classical education, how it's radically different from the current model we have, and how we can understand its pedagogy or its philosophy of teaching and learning, before going on to briefly discuss what a classical classroom looks like and why I'm convinced that classical education is good for our children, teachers, and indeed our world. Kon, who is our president, he will speak tonight for about 20 minutes as well on the classical education movement in Australia and how it's beginning to grow and change our educational landscape. And then we'll have some Q&A. So if there's anything you'd like to discuss at the end of the talk, please raise this during the Q&A. Also, if you'd like a copy of our slides, we're very happy to provide those too. Thank you. So let's start by asking, what is classical education? Classical education is a label that we use to describe how children were more or less educated in Western culture until about the 1800s. In a sense, this is a catch-all term, and we shouldn't be mistaken into thinking that it's a monolithic movement with one set theory and method. In fact, there are disputes about what would make for a proper education, and there are even several teaching methods today that aren't specifically classical, like Steiner and Charlotte Mason schools, that do adopt elements of classical education. And this is primarily because of the breadth of classical education. It has existed for millennia among diverse cultures and contexts, from ancient Greece and Rome to the kingdoms of medieval Europe and Byzantine Constantinople, and into the development of early modern nation states. Classical education also transcends religious divides and has been embraced by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And it has produced some of the greatest minds in Western society. Therefore, classical education is, if nothing more, evolving and adapting. And for that reason, it's actually perfectly suited to our contemporary times. Accordingly, instead of proposing that there is one kind of classical education, this evening we'll rather be looking at what marries together the various tributaries into a unified vision and practice. One way of getting a better understanding of classical education is by contrasting it with the one we have today. The prevalent form of education today is what is called progressive education. Its roots can be traced as far back as the French Enlightenment thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but it was perhaps best articulated by the philosopher John Dewey in the early 1900s. He championed an education that was focused more on experiential learning and problem solving than formal academics, and one that was led by student-centred creative curiosity. He therefore rejected rote learning, or what we would consider memorisation in education. Ultimately, the aim of progressive education was to mould good citizens who could fit into a rapidly industrialised world. Now, many of these elements of education might sound good to you, and indeed they are, but unfortunately for Dewey and his collaborators, they were less satisfactorily able to build up a new system than destroy the old one. And the project was soon taken over by administrative progressives, what we would call state educational experts, who still dominate our education system today. And perhaps like many of the revolutionary movements we've witnessed over the last 200 years, The cure that Dewey introduced was worse than the disease. And by the end of his life, Dewey stated that progressive education had, quote, not really penetrated and permeated the foundations of the educational institution, unquote. Rather than creating enlightened citizens, the close of the last millennium has witnessed progressive education transform schools into centralised, bureaucratic, standardised, and I trust I'm not being too cynical, economically driven degree factories. Of course, you likely share this view or you probably wouldn't be here tonight. So what's one way that we can compare the present system we labour under with that of classical education? I think one means of doing that is through using Aristotle's four causes. So the Greek philosopher Aristotle, in his books on physics and metaphysics, introduced four reasons or causes for change in the world. And I'll use the example of a house just to illustrate this if you're unfamiliar with it. First, we have the material cause, which is the constituent stuff of something. So if we talk about a house, it's the bricks, the glass, the wood that make up the house. We also have the formal cause, which is the structure or organising principle. In the case of a house, that would be the blueprint that tells you how to put together the wood, the bricks, the glass. We have, thirdly, the efficient cause. The efficient cause is the agent causation or the prime mover, the thing that actually gets the stuff happening. So with regards to a house, that would be the builders. They take the wood, the glass, the bricks, they look at the blueprint and they start building the house. And finally, for Aristotle, this was the most important, we have the teleological cause, which is the main cause for something. And obviously for a house, that would be for somebody to live in. So if we turn to classical education, we've missed the last section, but that's okay. If we turn to classical education, we can look at how these four causes relate to the progressive model and also classical education itself. So let's start with the material cause. When we look at the present system, education, in terms of its material cause, has a heavy reliance on textbooks, with students reading and absorbing, often without critical judgment, whatever is in the textbook. And perhaps some of you may have been educated in this way. The subjects that are taught and their content are kept contemporary and up to date, so that the most recent findings or trends are usually valued over those of the past. The way that curricula are designed are often to fulfil some socioeconomic and political objective. Finally, when it comes to the questions of ethics or morals, the influence of the Enlightenment really shines through progressive education. Because under this system, the child is viewed as innately good-willed, and it's only corrupted by ignorance or bad social environments. So for this reason, moral teaching is secondary and not central to a curriculum. Classical education, on the other hand, prefers to deal with primary texts as much as possible. So instead of reading textbooks about ancient Greek history, we read the actual historians like Thucydides and Herodotus. And what that means is that students develop at an appropriate level where they can confront the material and interpret it for themselves with teacher support. And it also means that this encourages the learning of these ancient languages. The subjects and content themselves are those which have been considered to stand the test of time. This doesn't mean that up-to-date knowledge is rejected, but that it must be knowledge, and not simply whatever is not novel or culturally fashionable. The guiding force behind curricula is not the whim of a political party or social group, but what tradition has demonstrated is good, true and beautiful. This is what G.K. Chesterton called participating in the democracy of the dead, so giving tradition a voice in our future. Lastly, there is a direct teaching of virtue in classical education. This is because classical educators recognise that the human condition is fallen, and people intrinsically suffer from both intellectual and moral vices that need to be instructed and virtuous habits disciplined. When we turn to the formal course, what's the structure of education? The progressive model has a very set curriculum with standards, capabilities and priorities that must be ticked off. If you look at, for example, if you go online and look at the Australian curriculum, it's very prescriptive in terms of what a teacher must do to pass a student. This focuses on students being able to demonstrate particular knowledge and skills, and therefore pedagogy or the art of teaching and learning, falls under a scientific paradigm. According to classical education, though, curriculum must be flexible. And even though knowledge and skills are important, there are other aspects of the human person, like ethics, spirituality, being in touch with nature, that are equally valued and part of the learning. For this model, pedagogy falls under the artistic paradigm, and it falls under the creative authority of the teacher. With regards to the efficient cause, or the agents of learning, in progressive education, the agents are primarily educational experts, that is, academics in university. Some of them have barely had any classroom experience. These people are the key formulators of both pedagogy and curriculum. And this partly explains why, particularly for teachers, those of us who have experience of this, every generation there's a revolutionary change in terms of what's taught and how it's taught, and schools panic to adapt to this. Additionally, there's a focus on student-centred learning where their interests dictate how learning occurs, and teachers are just facilitators of this. Contrarily, in classical education, teachers are the masters of their craft. They are the experts. They have the knowledge and wisdom on how to direct students' learning and coaching them in the habitus of cultural knowledge, skills and values. Lastly, and you won't see this on the screen, lastly, the teleological cause. That is, what's the end goal of education? And it's here that we can see the real contrast between how schools measure their success. For the contemporary progressive school, it has succeeded when graduates have positive pathways, either into a university course or else in becoming employed. This substantiates the idea that schooling is primarily for creating citizens who have knowledge and skills and can function as effective workers in society. It is essentially a utilitarian or pragmatic view of education. On the other hand, classical education is interested in the fully flourishing human being. This involves what is called paideia, that is, the passing on from one generation to the next of culture, of a way of life and relationships, of knowledge, skills and virtues. Thus, for a classical school, it has failed its mandate if, all things being equal, its students are knowledgeable but immoral. They're skillful in terms of science subjects but have little creativity. They're able sports players but they're spiritually immature. And so we can begin by talking about three common elements of classical education. Firstly, they share a pedagogy, how one teaches and learns. This uses methods drawn from ancient Greece and Rome, such as Socratic dialogues, mimetic instruction, debates, reflection and contemplation, and those practices which have stood the test of time to show that they actually work. There is also a shared subject matter, or what is taught. This also is drawn from the Greco-Roman world, especially in philosophy, but it too is content that is seen of enduring value in our Western tradition, in raising up the human spirit. In this sense, Dostoevsky, Dante and Raphael are just as classic as Plato, Pythagoras or Euclid. And lastly, classical education, irrespective of what kind of form it takes, shares an ethos or spirit, why it's taught. And this is partly drawn from the rationale of the Greco-Roman world, which is human flourishing, but this has been magnified by Christianity, where children are educated to know God, particularly through the transcendentals, what is true, good and beautiful. So, having compared these two approaches, I want to just go through some definitions. And I'll put up 4 definitions from various people where they talk about the different theoretical components of classical education. We'll leave them up for a few seconds so you can reflect on them for a little bit, and then if you'd like to get back at them with a Q&A, we can do so. The first is by Dr. Christopher Kern, who's one of the, really at the forefront of the classical education movement in the United States. And this is how he defines classical education. He says, classical education is a traditional education, commenced by the Greeks and Romans, extended during the Christian centuries, grounded in piety, governed by theology. It involves the deep study of the 7 liberal arts, and it gives access, therefore, to the great books that have been written, and it was designed to cultivate the humanity of men and women, that they might be characterised by wisdom, virtue, and eloquence. The next definition comes from Clark and Jane in their excellent book, The Liberal Arts Tradition. And if you want to get one book as an introduction to classical education, I would recommend this book. It's quite short, it's very readable, and you can easily find it online. So they write, Christian classical educational tradition embodies the kind of holistic and fully integrated curriculum that a thoroughly Christian understanding of human nature demands. It does so only when the 7 liberal arts are taken as part of a larger model consisting of what we here term piety, gymnastic, music, liberal arts, philosophy and theology. This full-orbed education aims at cultivating fully integrated human beings whose bodies, hearts and minds are formed respectively by gymnastic, music and the liberal arts, whose relationships with God, neighbour and community are marked by piety. The next extract is actually from an essay by Dorothy L. Sayers, and she wrote this at the beginning of the 20th century, and it's actually proved, it is one of the kind of educational bombs that went off to set off the classical education movement. And it's called The Lost Tools of Learning. Again, you can find this online very easily. And this is a part where she's talking about the liberal arts, in particular the trivium and quadrivium, which we will discuss in a bit. So she says, the medieval syllabus was divided into 2 parts, the trivium and quadrivium. It, the trivium, consisted of 3 parts, grammar, dialectic and rhetoric, in that order. Now the first thing we notice is that they, the elements of the trivium, are not what we should call subjects at all. They are only methods of dealing with subjects. Taken by and large, the great difference of emphasis between the 2 conceptions holds good. Modern education concentrates on teaching subjects, leaving the method of teaching, arguing and expressing one's conclusions to be picked up by the scholar as he goes along. Medieval education, and you could add ancient education along with that, concentrated on first forging and learning to handle the tools of learning, using whatever subject came handy as a piece of material on which to doodle until the use of the tool became second nature. And the last definition is by Mater Dei Academy, which is a classical school in the United States. And as part of introducing their curriculum, this is how they define classical education. They say, liberal and classical education emphasises the joy of learning for the sake of understanding what is true, what is beautiful, and what is good. It is an education which is formation for life rather than formation for work. A liberal education is the defining formation in educators and great minds who have shaped Western education in the preceding centuries. The twin pillars of philosophy and theology frame the other subjects and provide the context for a holistic education where the work of God the Creator pervades every aspect of human life, language, science, culture and the arts. And so we can identify some common elements in these definitions. And they are embraced or refined by classicists. They are the trivium and quadrivium, liberal arts and philosophy, piety and theology, virtue, the great books, and an integrated and holistic education. These are the many facets that make up the diamond that is classical education. So let us look at each briefly in turn. So the first characteristic I wish to highlight is the trivium, which is a bit of a cheat because it's actually 3 in 1. The word trivium means the 3 ways, and this teaches students how to master a discipline through progressive stages, kind of like a child first learns to crawl, then to walk, and then to run. The grammar stage, which is the first stage, involves comprehending the rudiments of a language or a subject. Dialectic, also called logic, how to use human reason to interrogate, analyse and manipulate the language or subject. And then finally rhetoric, how to create new written, oral and visual compositions with the language or subject. Again, we should understand the trivium not as three subjects, but as stages applied to learning that can cover all subjects or disciplines. Loosely, and in a kind of general manner, it can map onto these age groups. So the grammar stage is about from grades prep to 4, the beginning of academic schooling to around 10 years of age. Dialectic, about grades 5 to 8, 11 to 14 years old. And then lastly, rhetoric, grades 9 to 12, 15 to 18 years old. So as the child matures, he or she becomes more advanced in learning and the subject areas. So grammar is the basic one, represents the foundation of learning, of education. The Greco-Romans called it grammatiki, and the great rhetorician Quintilian regarded it as all the learning necessary to interpret a text, which would include the history, geography, and vocabulary around it. For Romans like Cicero, Livy, and Virgil, an education in grammar meant Latin, and the privileged place of ancient Greece and Greek and Latin in a classical education curriculum stems from this tradition, which is the original languages of so many great books. Learning a language also highlights the significance of this stage for every subject area, since grammar achieves these ends. It first teaches how to meaningfully recognise, copy, and interpret basic units, like letters, words, numbers, symbols, colours, musical notes, and so on. It exposes students to new concepts that they gradually become familiar with, nouns and verbs, odd and even numbers, musical time, etc. It trains students to memorise and make facts part of the self, so that they become information, building observation and memory. Grammar also shows the relationship between constituent parts and wholes through simple analysis, and it gives structure and order to thinking. And anyone who's had a very young child will know that this is the first thing you do in teaching them education. So one thing we should know about classical education, and this is perhaps one reason why it's very popular with homeschoolers, is that it's not some kind of fringe theory that's come from scientists telling parents and schools how to educate children. It actually comes from the natural way that children learn themselves. So if we go to the next stage, dialectical logic. This is the next progression of learning, and it focuses on developing independent reasoning. Its centrality to ancient thinking is evident in so many of Plato's dialogues, or else in its more formal application in Aristotelian philosophy. Into the Middle Ages, its most popular form was called the Disputatio, which you can see in, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. Dialectic involves taking the language acquired in the grammar stage to express coherent ideas through cogent arguments, or else developing new constructions. Put simply, it is to use knowledge one has to think well. This stage is significant because it teaches students how to validly string together individual components into greater wholes. It educates the mind in understanding and evaluating contradictory theses and antitheses, and how to derive syntheses from these conflicts. It encourages the asking of good questions, or what I call ordered inquisitiveness. It helps young people to develop clearer definitions and understandings. It trains critical thinking. And what I think is the most important, and what I see mostly lacking in students today, dialectic helps to inculcate attentiveness and precision in thinking and using language. It trains mental acuity so that young people are not thinking in a sloppy way. The final stage is rhetoric. And this involves transforming the control of grammar and dialectic into something more and something new. Primarily, we think of rhetoric as formal speech. However, it can take the shape of any new composition, which can be written, musical, visual, and so on. So whereas during the dialectic stage, students are taught how to think well, rhetoric expands this into the realm of creative communication. And it is important because it teaches students how to express themselves effectively. It encourages creativity through both content and the mode of communication. It engenders confidence in the learner as she masters language and is able to integrate her will and abilities before an audience. It uses self-reflection as a tool for further educational development, and it puts learning firmly into a communal context, having a strong practical application in our social world. And here's just a kind of, just a table that shows how the 3 stages relate to various forms of education, and also how there's a development in sophistication along the stages. So, if the trivium represents stages in the learning journey of a young person, it's really the quadrivium, which was also the other part of the 7 liberal arts, that would constitute more of what we would consider to be individual subjects. However, they're not precisely individuated because each of them is at its essence mathematical in nature. So their importance for the ancient Greeks stemmed from Pythagoras through to Plato in recognising numbers as essential to reality and truth. And this was a belief that continued into the Christian world as astronomers maintained that mathematics was the language of God's creation, which is a belief that is still held by many physicists today. So the quadrivium consists of 4 parts. One of the first parts is arithmetic. Now, arithmetic means more than just being able to add numbers together or use fractions. It's actually developing a number sense. It's becoming intimately familiar with numbers and their relations in a disposition of wonder, as one would master any language, and to show that numbers share a kind of marriage or a mutual embrace in the way they relate to each other. And the great mathematician Leibniz described this as a maze of the continuous. Arithmetic, as part of classical education, attempts to avoid at all costs that mundane attitude that causes students to moan about when they'd ever need to use algebra in life. I know when I was in high school learning algebra, I thought, what's the point of this? And I think once students start asking, why is this useful, instead of why is this true and beautiful, they're on the wrong track. And this is something that we are trying to get back to with classical education. Oh, thank you. And the next aspect is geometry. And there was an inscription above Plato's Academy that said, "Let none but geometers enter here." Historically, geometry has been based mostly on its Euclidean form, but this has developed since then. And it's a subject that takes the more abstract ideas of numbers in arithmetic and gives them dimension so that they occupy space as points, shapes, and objects, solid objects. Like arithmetic, the emphasis is not just on learning the facts or the what, but also learning what makes those facts true. Why? The truth of geometry in the world. And this is a leap into discovery and related to God's creation, as we can see in this famous 13th century image of Christ as the great geometer. Now, while it might seem odd to us, a third area of learning in the quadrivium is astronomy. Astronomy takes the arithmetical and geometric truths and applies them to the world, specifically to the relations of the heavenly bodies. It's also very useful for doing this, in that it brings together empiricism or observational learning with rationalism, the reasoned truth of mathematics, something that philosophically has actually been divided over the last few hundred years. And this continues to ingrain within students an integrated sense of reality. For our purposes today, even though we wouldn't really speak of astronomy as a subject, what astronomy did can really be encapsulated by the physical sciences themselves, by physics, chemistry, and biology. And lastly, perhaps most enchantingly, we have music, which might seem a bit of the odd man out. But music is actually the one subject in the quadrivium that harmonised everything. And this is epitomised in the medieval concept of the music of the spheres. There are 3 elements of music. The one we hold most commonly is called musica instrumentalis, which is the creation of harmony, melody and rhythm through instruments and vocals, what we would ordinarily consider music. However, there were 2 other elements. And these were musica mundana, which was a mathematical or musical relation seen between objects and bodies in the world, and musika humana, which was that same thing but applied to the social world, how humans related to one another and levels of society. So again, it's through music, and perhaps Joe could speak more on this later, being a music teacher. We see an interplay between the part and the whole that helps to build within the child a unified sense of the world. So traditionally, the trivium and quadrivium are understood as the 7 liberal arts. The term liberal here means free. That is, they're not learned for purposes of utility or work, but for purposes of growing the soul. As Aquinas wrote, they are, quote, called the liberal arts in order to distinguish them from those arts which are ordained to works done by the body, which arts are, in a fashion, servile, or like slaves, inasmuch as the body is in servile subjection to the soul, and man, as regards his soul, is free, unquote. More recently, liberal arts have been called the humanities because they are seeking to develop the human nature of a person. And these can be contrasted with more popular subjects these days, like STEM subjects, like engineering and technology. Because STEM subjects, and those like them, have a primarily practical purpose. They are there to prepare a student for the workforce. So paradoxically, when a parent or child complains about studying the liberal arts because they have no point, or what job will they get you, this is a sign that we're doing the right thing. Education is truly freeing when it cultivates the person instead of making the person a slave to an economic agenda. To the trivium and quadrivium, we can specifically add 2 disciplines, history and philosophy. Great, thank you. Now, philosophy was called the handmaiden of knowledge in the Middle Ages. It was seen as very, very important, but it was secondary to one subject, the queen of the sciences, which is theology. Theology is the study of divine revelation, applying human reason and experience to understand this, focusing on the various branches of God's communication with and transformation of humanity and the world. In theology, the Bible takes centre stage throughout a child's years of schooling, where it is revered, where texts are memorised, interpreted and mined as a source of Christian belief and practice. This is accompanied by magisterial documents from the Church, as well as key fathers like Augustine or Chrysostom, Basil and Aquinas. It involves both doctrinal teaching, but also lived experience through prayer, liturgy, disciplinary practices like fasting, and service to the community. Theology also aims at developing an awareness and love for all that is true, good and beautiful in the world, because these are seen as reflecting God's nature. So apart from some subject called religious education or theology, in a classical Christian education, theology informs the curriculum at all levels. There are no secular learning areas. Everything speaks of God, and this is made explicit. And I've got a quote there by Clark and Jane as well, where they state this. They say, quote, "Theology unifies the curriculum. It provides a framework for the liberal arts and sciences and the philosophies that unify them. In fact, the very notion of unity itself is derived from theology. All things were created by God, and by him all things continue to exist. In the broadest sense of the term, theology is the telos of the Christian classical curriculum, its end, not merely its culmination." And as a teacher at a Catholic high school, I pretty much witness how theology is mostly treated with disdain by students and mostly disregarded by staff members. Whereas it should really be at the front and centre of any school. So following from this, we should say a word about piety. For the ancient Romans, piety was an ideal virtue. Virgil speaks of pietas as the fulfilment of duty to one's nation, to one's family, to the gods. For the Greeks, as Socrates notes, piety is the justice due to the gods. And as Christians, we would heartily agree that this view of a proper reference and adoration due to the divine is right and good. Now, piety involves, obviously, it's not a subject that you can teach, but it is a habit that is inculcated. It is an inculturation, transmission of life, paideia. It is an attitude with which we attend all our learning both inside and outside the classroom. Moreover, piety involves the rituals and environments in which we engage, which at first glance may seem peripheral to education, but are in fact the very heart and soul of a good school. Piety is inherently connected with discipline, and we may wonder if the student management problems contagious in Western classrooms today are not in some way associated with our diminishment of piety in our society. So how does one train a student to be more pious? I'd suggest three broad dimensions, and these are generally part of what you will see in a classical school. Firstly, ritual. That first video from the school in Austria, it actually began by showing that every day the students engage in ordered ritual. Not simply prayer over the speaker, but they gather together and they have a liturgy. So this is one way of really kind of engaging students throughout their day into thinking of the divine, gratitude and respect. So rituals like prayer, scriptural reading, reflection, liturgy and so on. That's one way. Secondly, discipline. And this involves directly teaching manners, punishing wrongdoing in a context of justice, fasting and other mortifying practices. And then finally, affection. Inculcating the love in students for others, which is driven by both the emulation of staff and peers, but also the embodiment of what they have learnt. So for a Christian classical education, piety will necessarily be informed by theology and the religious culture of a school community. So the idea of a school teaching piety is likely jarring for many modern educators. This is because we have largely evacuated virtues from the educational environment. However, for classical education, moulding young people to be virtuous is a primary goal. We can understand virtues by this succinct definition by Dr. Paul Morrissey, and he's the president of Campion College, which is a classical college in New South Wales, really Australia's first classical education school, and probably its most premier. He writes this, quote, "Virtues are a disposition of character learned through instruction, imitation and practice. They incline a person more willingly and ably to do good and to avoid evil." Unquote. The ancient Greeks gave us four cardinal virtues: justice, fortitude or strength of character and integrity, temperance, being proportional in our decision making, and prudence or wisdom. To this, Christianity added faith, hope, and charity, or love. These seven virtues should especially guide a child in his or her education. But how does this happen? Firstly, there is overt instruction in virtue. For example, drawing on Bible stories or the lives of the saints, or from fables by Aesop, or fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm. Recognising the wisdom through different philosophies or theologies. Or we can look to the perseverance of scientists in their experimentation. However, even though we can teach virtues through the curriculum, they are mostly absorbed and habituated by the ethos of the school community. The rituals and disciplinary practices it engages in to build fortitude and temperance, the environment it exposes young people to, and the models of behaviour demonstrated by staff and students. So I trust that in all this so far, you have seen how classical education is both holistic and integrated in its nature. It is integrated in that it doesn't see subjects as separate from each other, but they speak to one another in a kind of intimate conversation. Now, sometimes integration is done in a classical school where there is no delineation between subjects and one naturally flows into the other. Sometimes integration is less pronounced. Nevertheless, classical curricula have a tendency to integrate in at least three ways. Firstly, the subjects reflect a consistent, overt and unifying Christian worldview. For example, if you're learning about the atomic theory in science, this will also be taught in the context of God's creation and associated with similar studies in theology and philosophy. Secondly, is that there is a shared pedagogy or way of learning and teaching that's applied throughout all the years of schooling. And then, finally, there are texts and themes that cross the subject boundaries. For instance, there might be one fortnight's learning where the theme question is, what is a hero? And so this question will then be explored throughout the different learning areas. So classical education is inherently integrated. Secondly, it is holistic. That is to say, it aims to develop the whole human person, which is frequently missed in our times of specialisation and the compartmentalisation of knowledge we have. Classical education returns us to a time of the Renaissance man, when there isn't such a thing as scientific learning in one corner, artistic learning in another corner, philosophical learning in another corner, but simply learning to be human. How is classical education holistic? It does these things. It trains students to transform facts into knowledge, which then inform and change the self. So facts are not simply there to memorise for a test, but to actually change who you are. Secondly, it trains students to transform skills into habits so that they become part of the child as she moves towards mastery of something. Thirdly, it trains students to transform moral reasoning and experience into virtue to become a better person. Fourthly, to transform aesthetic appreciation into a love of beauty so that the student can recognise beauty but also create beauty. And lastly, it trains students to transform religion and theology into a profound relationship with God and His church. So looking a bit at the content then. Classical education values content that is of enduring worth in growing the human spirit and helping young people to flourish. These works aren't always academically difficult, but they do involve challenging ideas, themes and existential questions that are perennial, such as how should I live? What makes a good society? Or what happens when I die? They help to cultivate wisdom and virtue containing an immense depth that allows for polyvalent interpretations. Most importantly, when taught well, they never get dull but become more and more interesting. These are what are called the great books. Now, Isaac Newton is famous for having once expressed in a letter, he said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Now, he didn't originate this idiom, but he certainly exemplified it. And geniuses like Newton recognised their reliance and debt on the rich patrimony of the West. And this was mostly embodied in the great books. What are these books? Firstly, they're not all books. We could include among them the funeral oration of Pericles, Bach's Brandenburg concertos, or the Madonnas of Raphael. All the works of human greatness that are worthy of our reflection and study, that give us profound truths about ourselves, our world and the divine. These would all be considered part of the great books. Secondly, though many are, they are not all from ancient Greece and Rome. Every nation and period has its own great books. I can confidently say, for instance, that the Chinese epic Sangwo Yanyi or the Mahabharata from India stand alongside Homer, Virgil and Dante. Australia too has poets like Patterson and Lawson whose worth transcends their generation. Thirdly, these books are of enormous moral value. In promoting a classical Christian curriculum, the great books present students with figures to emulate, villainous acts to critique, the complexity of ethical decision-making, and virtues to wear as their own. Perhaps for me, no recent author springs more to mind than someone like Dostoevsky, who's able to do this for a young student. Lastly, these books are of artistic and literary value. They are beautiful. This can be seen from the fact that they have survived, whereas countless others are forgotten. They have survived precisely because they are loved for what they offer. Now, there are many examples of great books. I've got some there. First and foremost, I would say the Bible, which is a rich library for study for any student. But then there are many others that can be explored at different levels for different purposes. I think in our resources that we'll talk about at the end, I think there's a list where you can find some great books, and I'm sure there's probably one at the back table. So in summing up our theoretical overview of classical education, I'd like to return to Christopher Perrin's definition, because I think he provides really the most comprehensive of the definitions. He says, again, classical education is a traditional education commenced by the Greeks and Romans, extended during the Christian centuries, grounded in piety, governed by theology. It involves the deep study of the 7 liberal arts and gives access, therefore, to the great books that have been written, and it was designed to cultivate the humanity of men and women, that they might be characterised by wisdom, virtue, and eloquence. So that's the theory. Next slide. That's the theory in a nutshell. Oh, by the way, that school was Hillsdale College. Hillsdale College is one of probably the most well-known and the most effective classical schools in the United States. It's an evangelical Christian school, so if you're interested in seeing what does a classical school really look like, I would highly recommend looking at Hillsdale College. They're very good. So anyway, that's the philosophy of classical education. But what does it look like in practice? So for the remaining 5-10 minutes or so, I just want to go through sketching out what a classical school might look like in various ways. So just briefly covering the classroom environment, the teaching styles and methods that are employed, some examples of work that might be undertaken by students, and the overall school culture. Now, these are just my personal examples. Obviously, there are others that will employ different ways and have different views. So looking at the classroom, in terms of the classroom environment, when setting it up, it's important to keep in mind the aim of education, which is human flourishing. Therefore, the human component is front and centre of any classroom, and whatever distracts from that should really be peripheral or not in the classroom at all. Moreover, the significance of training in discipline and virtue should be reflected through an orderly and not overly elaborate classroom. Practically, the format of students' desks should be flexible, depending on the learning style being taken. So if there's direct teacher instruction, that might require the traditional row of seats or individual desks, whereas when there is class discussion and debate, a U-shape or group tables better facilitate this. The front of the room should be dominated by a blackboard or a whiteboard, with the teacher's desk to the side, because it's here that the teacher focuses the class's attention and conveys much of the learning. The board is an important space for corporate expression and visual concepts. The classroom itself should be decorated in such a way that it's both beautiful and functional, and any posters or maps or vocabulary that are used should be conducive to the learning. However, the teacher should avoid too many visual stimulants. Simplicity is better than embellishment. In fact, if a teacher is tempted to cover all the walls with teaching aids, it's probably better that they be stripped bare. In this sense, a beautiful classroom should take precedence over a functional classroom. A clear Christian presence should also be apparent in every room, and it would be preferable if there's bookshelves available with the reading material. Objects that distract students from learning and their shared humanity should be kept at a minimum. In this regard, computers and mobile phone use should really be limited, as such technologies tend to encourage the opposite of what we're trying to learn through classical education. In terms of teaching methods employed in a classical classroom, these are some of the prominent ones, some of which you'll be familiar with, and probably many of which you'll be familiar with, because again, classical education is not some kind of esoteric theory of education. It's just something that's practical, something that's pretty much common sense, and something that's been practiced for centuries and centuries. The first is direct instruction. Very traditional, lecture-style format where the teacher primarily informs students by disseminating and explaining ideas. This is very helpful in presenting a lot of information quickly or building stories of knowledge upon a firm foundation. Another method is Socratic questioning, which comes to the truth by asking perceptive questions. A dialogue is engaged between the teacher and student that principally seeks to clarify concepts, use language with precision, identify contradictions, and so forth. It's a powerful tool for learning because it helps students arrive at the truth after a train of thought and on their own realisation. as opposed to the more kind of didactic form of direct instruction. Another important method is group discussions and debates. So these take Socratic questioning, but kind of extend them into a more sophisticated conversation. And the last two are also connected, mimetic teaching, which is probably the most potent way of learning. It's the way that any child learns how to do something, through imitation. So in the mimetic teaching, the teacher leads students from what they already know into new knowledge by doing what the teacher does, so that over time, the student herself turns into the teacher. Obvious examples of this would be in practical subjects like carpentry or textiles or music, where this is still practiced very much today. And this also involves, lastly, repetition, which is a more basic form of mimesis. Again, Dr. Kern, who I seem to be quoting a lot, he expands upon this by highlighting 8 teaching styles that are important for classical educators. The first is festina lente, which means make haste slowly. And what this means is that there should be an appropriate balance between time and content. So when a student learns a topic, they should be given the due time required to internalise it, but not simply just dwell on it forever, essentially. They need to move on, but there needs to be appropriate time given. The second principle is connected with this, multum non multa, or much not many. And this is the idea that advises mastery over simply being an amateur learner in something. So it's better for a student to be truly knowledgeable and immersed in a few passages of Homer's Iliad than to have read the whole work but really only understand it at a shallow level. The third principle, repetitio mater memoria, repetition is the mother of memory. And this notes the effectiveness of techniques that inculcate learning through repetition. For example, repeating times tables or spelling, using jingles and poems, doing the same muscular exercise in different contexts. The fourth, songs and chants. This is connected with the previous principle and says the idea that music as a way of learning is very effective and was actually employed more in the past than it is today. Number 5, embodied learning. This is the principle that students learn through imitation, that they imitate the teacher, and so this advises the teacher to take seriously how they exhibit their own craft, but also how they exhibit their own character. 6, educational virtues, that intellectual virtues are cultivated through each subject to become part of the learner. 7, wonder and curiosity, that learning isn't just for facts, but also for developing a sense of awe about the world, and the school environment helps do that. And then lastly, scholar and contemplation, which is about restful learning, that for a student to really learn something, they need time to dwell with it, so that it inhabits them and they become friends with their learning, rather than just simply acquaintances, as often happens in education today. I've got an example here. This is from the Ambrose curriculum. This is a Christian classical school in Idaho in the United States. And this is part of a unit in biology on evolution. And these are the teaching goals. And I thought I'd bring this up because it really shows how they have integrated and attempted to kind of touch the holistic nature of learning through how they're teaching here. Particularly if you look at, for instance, steps 10 to 12. So 10, define, compare, contrast, micro and macro evolution, drawing on skills that you would learn in literature or English, as well as science. 11, explain how Darwin developed his hypothesis, skills that you would draw from philosophy and history. And then 12, articulate how studying evolution confirms the presence of Creator. So here it also draws on theology. So in this one unit, students are drawing from various subjects to build an integrated sense of learning, rather than just talking about evolution in a scientific context. So lastly, I'd like to talk about, well, what does the school itself look like? Outside the walls of the classroom, what should a classical school try to model? It should be a school that inspires awe and love of learning. One that embodies consistent Christian ritual and liturgy, frequent prayer, participation in the sacraments. These should be an expectation. It's a school whose environment and architecture speaks of Christian truth, goodness and beauty, with paintings, statues, the presence of nature, bringing the wonder of human creativity in interaction with that of God's creation. A school in touch with the tradition of the church. One, importantly, that involves parents and the faith community. Many successful classical schools in the United States have a connection with homeschooling, because they see the importance of involving the family in learning and not disassociating the two, as again often happens in progressive education. It's a school where discipline is rigorous, just, and the opportunity to grow in virtue. And lastly, a classical school is one that actively promotes the creation and engages students in the study and contemplation of nature. So learning goes beyond the physical classroom to encompass the outdoors. The star-filled night is a better teacher than any computer screen. So I'd like to finish, before I finish, I'd just like to reflect a little bit on how classical schools are, how they're doing in terms of an enterprise in the contemporary world. Now, unfortunately, there haven't been many in-depth studies of the successes of classical schools. This one is from a study that was released in 2020 by the Association of Classical Christian Schools. You can look them up. This is an association in the United States. They comprise of something like 200 to 300 classical schools throughout the country. And so they studied their graduates, and they drew up a comparative study with graduates from other evangelical Christian schools, from Catholic schools, from other private non-religious schools, and from public schools. So just in terms of quickly going through this data, one thing I'd like to highlight is just how successful students in these classical Christian schools have been in many of the domains that the study looked at. In terms of college and career, they outperformed everyone. Outlook on life and Christian practices and Christian life, they outperformed everyone. Traditional, conservative, independent, and being influential to others in their lives. So if you look at that, just a summary down the bottom of the right-hand corner, they were by far the most successful, then homeschoolers, and then evangelical and private preparatory schools. So when it even comes to the SATs, or the Scholastic Aptitude Test, which is the test in the United States to enter college, again, students who graduated from these classical Christian schools outperformed all the other schools, even independent private schools. And they're also their continued education was seen to be good. Next slide, please, Joe. Okay, so that's where I'll finish today. Again, once we return to the Q&A, if you have any questions about anything I've said, please raise them. Thank you, Con.
First of all, thank you for coming. There's a lot to take in. And we don't expect you all to remember all this tonight. But I want to thank Jonathan for being thorough and for just taking us through, because look, classical education is a journey. And we don't have to become experts in 24 hours. I've been researching it for 4 years and I'm still learning. But my name is Kon Bouzikos, I'm the president. And look, I want to just introduce our committee tonight. This is our first event. I want to thank you, Father Jeff. I want to thank the fathers and everyone for coming. We have Helen Couture. Helen, if you could just stand up, please. Helen is our vice president. Helen's a teacher as well. And she has a lot of passion for education, classical education and the curriculum. We also have John Smyth. John Smyth will be speaking after me. John Smyth will be telling you a little bit about the tour for Andrew Kern. We have Terence Liu. Terence Liu is in charge of our website. Most of you maybe have visited our website, all the work, and Terence has done a lot of great work there. Thank you, Terence. We also have Connor Ross. Connor Ross just joined us last year. He's a teacher at Mentone Girls Grammar, and he's also overseeing the curriculum. To get these schools up, we need curriculum. So thank you, Connor. Jonathan, who's just spoken, is our secretary. At the back there, Joe, if you can give us a wave. Joe is one of the co-founders of Classical Education and has a strong interest in music. So if we can go to the first slide, thanks, Joe. So I want to just tell you a little bit about us. We started a couple of years ago. At the moment, there are many people that are following us across all of Australia. Queensland, New South Wales, Perth, even Tasmania. We have a committee, as I've just told you. We're volunteers. We don't get paid for this because we believe in this. We truly believe in this. We have a website, and we're going to continue. Some of the things we've done so far, we've got a newsletter, and if you came earlier, there is a piece of paper. If you don't subscribe to our newsletter, please write your name and your email, and you'll get it every month. We have a website. We do professional development because to understand classical education, teachers need to understand the techniques, the way of teaching, and that's not easy. So what are we doing? We're offering professional development. And who are we learning from? The Americans. You heard Jonathan before. The Americans are excelling in classical education. You know why? Because they've been doing it for 40 years. Here, we've just started. So it's going to take time in our country, but it's worthwhile. We have book clubs. We write letters. We've had conferences. We have YouTubes. I'm on YouTube. We're going to put up these ones tonight on YouTube. So we've got YouTube videos. We have Instagram. We use all those platforms that we have to use. But what's missing from ACES, and we're doing it tonight, we want to have more face-to-face. What's the point of having a nice website if we're not meeting you? And tonight is our first one, but guess what? We're going to be doing more of these sessions. Next slide, please. We want to do more seminars. We want to do more professional development. We want to invite guest speakers from around the world. And guess what? John will be telling you soon. In less than 4 weeks' time, Andrew Kern will be coming for the first time to all of Australia. Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney, and also Toowoomba. We want to do a curriculum. That takes time, dear friends. That takes a lot of time. But we've started. And who are we learning again from? The Americans. But saying the word curriculum, we have to create a curriculum that is tailored to Australian standards. We can't just copy what the Americans are doing. We're Australians. We look at their examples, but we have to tailor it to our context, to what we're learning here in Australia. But we can learn from them. And obviously, we have to get accreditation. Now, there are people, dear friends, who have created classical schools in Australia. The first school, and you can just Google them, Toowoomba Christian College. Okay, they are an evangelical classical school, a bit like Hillsdale, which is what Jonathan mentioned. They're prepped to 12, I believe, and they're doing a lot of good things. Next slide, please. St. Philomena's is another school. Well, just let you read their motto. Goes back to what Jonathan said. Human formation, not just getting a job. Next slide, please. Okay, St. John of Costan. Now, St. John of Costan is an Orthodox classical school which started in January this year. Father Stephen Davis, some of you maybe have met him. I'll let you just read that for a second. Again, all the things that Jonathan mentioned. So all the things that Jonathan mentioned are happening in Australia. Perth, now this is not a school, this is actually a hybrid. When I say a hybrid, it's small classes, and I think it meets in the parish hall. They don't actually have a school, a building, the other two do. It's a hybrid school where students go after hours to the parish hall there in Perth, and they have tutors, and it happens after hours. So there are different ways, ladies and gentlemen, that we can introduce classical education. We don't have to have a fully grown school. That would be nice, but we can start small. In parish halls, we have churches in Melbourne. If every priest gets a few families together and says, we're going to do something, it can happen, dear friends. It starts small. Hartford College. Hartford College is a Catholic classical school in Sydney. Started last year. And they're doing a lot of wonderful things. Augustine Academy, again, another classical school in Sydney. Wonderful things. Next slide, please. Yeah, now Jonathan mentioned this before, Campion College. Now this is a tertiary liberal arts college. Okay, so this is where people go after they've graduated from high school. Wouldn't it be nice if we had something in Melbourne? That's something to work towards. Next slide, please. Melbourne, yes, so dear friends, we live in Melbourne. Okay, so that's what we brought you tonight. We want to create a classical school. And you know what? Father Jeff said something very important before, very beautiful. It can happen. If it can happen in Queensland, if it can happen in Sydney, if it can happen in Perth, then why can't it happen in Melbourne? Something to think about. Why can't it happen in Melbourne? And we don't need thousands of people to get behind this. We just had a couple of families, a couple of priests, you and I together working for the common cause. We can do it, friends. We can do it slowly. Now, let me tell you some sad news. Look at dot point 2. Do you know that there were attempts to create classical schools in Melbourne? Newman Academy in Caulfield and Our Lady of Fatima, but those, they were thwarted, they were blocked. Now, it doesn't mean we get disillusioned. It doesn't mean that you say, well, then what's the point, Con? What's the point if they were blocked? It just means that we need to continue. We need to not give up. Because that's what Father said before. That's what Joe said before. We are countercultural, but we have to do the good fight. Because don't forget, God is with us. God is with us. Now, some of you might have children that want to learn online classical schooling. Well, there you go. If I want to take a photo of that. There is something called Via Classica. The lady that runs this used to live in Melbourne. She's now gone to New South Wales. Very committed person. Very committed person. Now, Jonathan mentioned the word resources. Did you know that in Australia where you can buy classical education resources? The lady's name is Sarah O'Dea. She lives in Brisbane in Queensland. She's got a website called Logos Australis. Jump onto the website tonight, tomorrow, next week. You can buy resources because guess what? To buy books from America costs a lot of money. A lot of money. But you can buy them through her. You can buy these resources. Johnson mentioned before Christopher Perrin, Classical Academic Press. She buys these books. She gets books from all the American publishers for us Australians. There's also something called Classical Conversations. Cherie Harvey's in charge of that. They did something a week ago. Now, these are the websites. If you want to take a photo of this. Yeah, these are the websites that I suggest you go to. If you're starting on classical education, these are the websites that all of us on the committee started 4 years ago. Okay, CiRCE, and John will be saying a few more words about that. So these are the places to go to. And please don't, just slowly, take it slowly. Johnson mentioned the last website. Next slide, please. I think that's the last one. Okay, books. Yeah, please take this photo too. If you want to know more about classical education, you have to read books. It's good to go to websites. It's good to go to podcasts. It's good to, but you need to read books. And I think Johnson's already mentioned a few.
Yeah, Con.
Yes.
Yes. Can we go back a bit?
Yeah.
If you go to that last website, the Association of Classical Christian Schools, they have all the schools who are part of their association, all 200-300 of them listed there with their websites. That way you can actually go and look at each school to get a sense, more of a sense of what these schools are doing, because they're very good at promoting themselves most of the time.
Okay. So they're the books, and I think that's the last one for me, yes. So I was very short and brief because I'm conscious of time, and I want to allow for Q&A. So I'm going to ask now John. John, if you could please come up. John is going to tell you a little bit about the tour that's happening in 3 weeks. Thank you, John.
So, as Con said, my name's John Smyth, and I'm here mainly because I'm organising some events in a couple of weeks, which I'll tell you about shortly. I just first wanted to ask a couple of questions, just to get a sense of our audience here. Who here before you? Oh, thank you. Who here before you came tonight already knew something about classical education? Who already knew something about it? Okay, so looks like maybe half or slightly more than half. This wasn't entirely new, because Jonathan's presentation was amazing. It was really comprehensive, covered a lot of stuff. It was a really great introduction to classical education. Who here is thinking about, finding a school that they can send their kids to? Who here is in that camp? Looking around. What school am I going to send my kids to? Okay, so there's definitely a few here like that. I myself would say I'm here because I'm a parent of 4 young children, and I really want to pass on a great education to them. I want to give them a really great. We want to put them in a really good school, give them a really great education. And there are 1 or 2 good schools around. It's not a complete wasteland. But obviously, I think a lot of you are probably here because you've looked around at the schools that we have and thought, not too excited about that, or even a little bit concerned. Western civilization right now seems to be, looking a little bit wobbly, both economically, socially, politically. People are a little bit worried, and our educational system is a great example of that. There's some concerns about where's it going, what's happened there. Seems to be going in some weird directions. And so I think classical education, I'm very sure of this, it represents the last best hope for Western civilization. And as Con said, in America, they're well down this track. They realised this 20 or 30 years ago, and they've been building schools and developing this classical education movement there for decades. Just in the last 10 years, there's been over 500 classical schools have started in America. In 10 years, over 500 schools have started there. And we're just starting to catch up and get onto this train. I'm also a school teacher, and another reason I've become really passionate about classical education, I want it for my own children, but I also want it for my students. And I want to be part of a school that is passing on this great tradition, this beautiful, this true, good and beautiful classical education to students. I want to be part of that myself. So one of the ways I thought I could contribute to that is to bring out some of these American experts, that have been doing this for decades, some of the best people in the world. I wanted to bring a couple of them out here. And so in just under a month, we've got Andrew Kern and Katerina Hamilton, who both work at the CiRCE Institute. That's one of the great classical education organisations that you saw up on the screen earlier. Andrew Kern is the founder and president of the CiRCE Institute, and he's really recognised as one of the best people in that movement. So he's going to come out and he's going to go to Toowoomba Christian College was mentioned in that list of schools, and then Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. He's going to visit all those cities and run professional development seminars for teachers. Because here in Australia, basically, if you're a teacher, there's nowhere you can really go. Maybe Campion College a little bit, but there's nowhere that's going to train you to be a classical teacher. And so this is just the first step in starting to provide that for teachers. They're also going to give presentations about classical education to groups of parents in each city as well. In the cases of Brisbane and Sydney, there are already existing schools, so it'll be in large part to promote those schools and get more parents interested and excited, and hopefully more schools will flow out of that. But especially here in Melbourne, I'm really hoping that these events, similar to tonight in a way, will kind of throw up a bat signal to parents around Melbourne who want to provide a great education for their kids, and they are looking for that classical education difference, that they're going to come along, and this guy is going to blow everyone away. He's an amazing presenter and a beautiful human being as well, and Katerina Hamilton as well is actually his daughter. I should let you know. She works with him at the Institute, at the CiRCE Institute, and she's been teaching in classical education for about 15 years as well. Yeah, they're going to blow everyone away, and I'm very hopeful and even confident that in Melbourne we're going to get a couple of classical Catholic schools will, be inspired to begin from this genesis. Maybe it's even happened tonight. I think Kon and Jonathan have made a really good case. So if I can ask everyone, grab out your phones. If you haven't already been to this website down the bottom, classicaleducation.com.au. Punch it in, you'll see the two events in Melbourne are on Tuesday the 4th of June. That's they're going to give a presentation at Australian Catholic University in the city in East Melbourne. So that'll, I hope, bring together a large number of parents and teachers and other interested people from around Melbourne. That's Tuesday the 4th of June. And then on the 5th of June, there'll be a professional development seminar, which is aimed at both teachers and parents. There's actually just as many parents that have signed up for that already as teachers, because there's a lot of homeschooling parents that really want, that are doing classical education and they want to get more into it. So that's open to everyone. I encourage you to have a look at those events and come along to one or both if you're able to. Just on the professional development seminar on the 5th, there's a price attached to that, and if that's a problem for anyone, just talk to me or contact me, and we'll work something out. I don't want anyone to miss out on these events because of money. So that's all from me. Thanks very much.